After I sat down this morning that I never really introduced myself this morning, so I'll take that opportunity now. I'm Shawn Clem. I know many of you in the room and many of you are new faces to me. I've been here at Corkscrew for just about 10 years. I actually haven't been working within Corkscrew except for the last few years. I was physically here but doing some work in the Big Cypress for about 6 years, and then was actually here doing work on sport fish down in Florida Bay for a year, and then have kind of refocused here at Corkscrew. So one of my big tasks in the last couple of years has been really trying to dig into the data sets that we are sitting on here at Corkscrew. We've been, here since the mid-50s collecting data. A lot of times, our early volunteers and early staff were, collecting good observational data. We've got water level data, rainfall data that we've been collecting for a long time. Over the years, as the sanctuary's changed and Audubon has changed, we've been collecting data in different ways, different people, in different places, and so part of what I've been doing is kind of trying to put that all back together and really be able to start really digging into the hydrologic and the Wood Stork and the other, the ecological story of the data that we have here at the sanctuary. So of course, when I chose this topic back in November, I thought the hydrology would be kind of a insignificant thing, but it's not. So I'm going to just start off talking a little bit about this year's hydrology and kind of what that looks like based on the hydrologic record that we have here. This is typical for us throughout the hydrologic year, and the way I think of a hydrologic year is from June 1st to May 31st. You can see these are our typical high water months in June, July, August. September is a little bit in the middle. Once we get to October, that's really the end of our rainy season. We do still sometimes get some tropical storms through in October. That'll give us some rain, but usually from October through the rest of the winter we're pretty dry, except for this year. Wow. This actually is our rainfall as of yesterday. Did anybody look at our rainfall, what we got yesterday? Maker, any of you guys? I think we probably got at least another ½ inch of rain yesterday. So we're looking at it, we're at about 9.5 inches or so of rain, which you can see is way above average for January. That beats our previous record of 8.5 inches or so that we set back in 1991. So this is the highest on record for Corkscrew for January. So what does that look like for our standing water out there? This is a graph, you're going to see a few of these. This dashed line is the maximum daily water depth that we have on record here at the sanctuary. This is the minimum daily water depth. It bottoms out at 0 because these are staff gauge data. These are from a staff gauge located out in the Lettuce Lakes area of our boardwalk. And this red line is this year. So as of just yesterday, we finally hit that all-time record high for the daily depth for that day, for, what was it, January 28th. I haven't looked at the gauge today. I think we're a little bit higher today than we were yesterday. So we're now at record-setting stage for this day of the year. So I kind of thought, because this really spiked up when we were about here. When I was thinking about what I was going to say in this talk 2 weeks ago, even, I was thinking, well, we're high, but we're not crazy high, and I'll talk about how, it seems wet, but let's put it in perspective of previous decades. Now we're crazy high. So I'm going to leave that out of it because we're just have a lot of water out there compared to what we were expecting. So these are the data that we have. Water level data, where we've got 2 staff gauges on the boardwalk. Again, one is in the Lettuce Lakes, one's on the kind of edge of the Cypress. We have daily rainfall data. The water depths go back to about the beginning of 1957 or so, and the rainfall data, right now I have back to 1969. I think we have earlier data, I just haven't gotten my hands on them quite yet. Again, with the older data sets, it's a little bit patchy. Sometimes back in the 60s, I've got water depths twice a month, and sometimes I have just monthly totals for rainfall, so I don't have the data don't really get really complete till about mid-70s or so. I start getting kind of a good consistent data set. So I've been working on putting them all together. So here, again in red, is this year, and then I've added in the lines for the other 5 years, 6 years since 2000, so since 2010. So this is basically each line representing 1 year's water since 2010 with the same maximum and minimum lines that you saw before. So one way I've started looking at these data is to look at that kind of middle 50% of the data. So looking at what we call the interquartile range. So it's basically the 25th to the 75th percentile. Just kind of think of as, I don't want to use average because you get kind of a wacky water year like this and it throws your average way off. But if you look at kind of that median water level, you can get a real good picture, I think, of what that water year looks like. So I'm going to show you a couple of these graphs, and that's what this shaded area is. This is that median, or that interquartile range from the from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile. If I take these lines out of the way, you can get a real good picture of the shape of what the water looks like over that period of time. So I looked at this for the last, since 2010, and then I started putting these together for the previous decades. And so this is, the current decade. This is back into the 2000s, the 90s, twice a month. So it looks a little bit cleaner. It's probably not any cleaner. It's just the data that we had. So did you see what just changed there? This is really different than what we're seeing now. And that was the first thing that struck me digging back into these data. Look at the long Hydra period. I kind of stumbled upon this thinking about wood storks and thinking about Hydra period and saying, well, let's look at the Hydra period at the lettuce lakes. So I started looking back in time, and it was continuously inundated. I've only been here, 10 years. A lot of the other staff and volunteers have only been here during the window of time that the lettuce lakes dry every year. And so the idea that that this isn't normal, or this isn't what we used to see here at Corkscrew, was a surprise to me, not a surprise to people like Mike and Jean who had been here for longer, but this was news to us that things are really different now than they used to be. So I started looking again. I'll go back through these forward. This is the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, wow, the 90s. This is the 2000s. This to me is kind of the break point of this is when things really got to be very different here at Corkscrew. And then this is the last, since 2010. So we're seeing really dramatic differences, in what we're seeing in the hydrology here at Corkscrew now compared to what we had historically. If you look at this quantitatively and just compare the Hydra period, so I just looked at the number of days per year we were inundated. How long is that Hydra period? Back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, we had this real long Hydra period, almost always inundated. We only really used to dry out about once every other year, 40 to 50% of the years. Back in those decades, we dry out. Since 2000, those lettuce lakes go dry every single year. Looking at what that means for what is the length of the dry down, on average, back in the 70s, we would dry down a day or two. In the 80s, about 10 days. Again, in the 90s, we're pretty similar, about 9 days. 2000, on average, we're drying about 10 weeks out of the year. And 2010, since then, we're drying down about 11 weeks out of the year. So it's a really marked change in the hydrology, or in the Hydra period. The 60s data weren't complete enough for me to really look at Hydra period, but kind of eyeballing those data, there was really a maximum of 2 years that could have dried down at all, and if they did dry down, the duration of that dry down would have been less than a week or so. So I kind of played with the stats on this, and I've been torturing myself over the last week with how to really show this statistically, and I don't really have a good way to show it, but basically we're reaching the same maximum water levels that we did in previous years. We are shortening the Hydra period, so obviously we're getting a much faster recession. You can tell if we were to go back to those graphs, the slope of that dry season recession is markedly increased over what we've seen in previous years. We've gone from that real long, slow dry down to something that's much more abrupt. So where is this coming from? The first thing I was curious, well, has rainfall changed? So I looked at the total annual rainfall over the decades, and there's no statistical variation in it at all. I broke it down by wet season and dry season, and we did see significant variation in the wet season total rainfall, but it actually told me that the 90s was actually drier than 2010. If you go back to those graphs, that's not what we were seeing with those water levels. We were seeing 2010 or 2000 forward, actually the water levels being lower. So in the 90s, despite getting less rain, we still had higher water levels than we did in subsequent decades. And the total dry season variation hasn't changed over the time period. So then I kind of was gotten to thinking, well, is this a corkscrew problem? Is this a problem that we're just seeing here with the changes in land use around the sanctuary and in crew, or is this a larger scale problem? So I looked at a data set that I was just familiar with. I had this gauge here from Big Cypress. It's in the Bear Island area. It's not by any means hydrologically unimpacted, but it still gives us a longer data set, someplace that's geographically far enough from Corkscrew that there's going to be different land stressors here than we see down here. And we saw a pretty similar pattern. We saw that the Hydra period, and that was a data set that I just looked at from 1991 through 2009, so I was able to just compare basically the 90s to the 2000s. And the Hydra period was markedly shorter in the 2000s compared to the 90s. And that was, the scale on which we were seeing it was very similar to what we saw at Corkscrew. In the 90s, this was drying about a week out of the year, and in the 2000s, it was drying about 7.5 weeks out of the year. Then I wanted to look at rainfall. Is there some kind of weird rainfall pattern? We know rainfall can be very patchy in South Florida. So I pulled longer term data set that we had up here in the 70s at this rainfall gauge up off of, it's off Alico Road. It's actually off State Road 82, I think. But they had rainfall back to the 70s. And so we looked at a rainfall across the decades there, and again saw no variation in rainfall. So for whatever's going on here appears to not be rainfall driven. So for Corkscrew's period of record, we're seeing little to no variation in the peak water level or the rainfall. And since 2000, the Hydra period is markedly shorter and dry season recession rates are higher. And it looks like these changes in hydrology are not unique to our watershed. It looks like a bigger picture problem than just a Corkscrew or a crew problem. So then the next question is why I started looking at this in the first place is, what does it do to these guys? And so thinking about what does the changes in hydrology mean when you translate it down to the level of a wood stork. We know that in South Florida, or at least throughout the whole Everglades region, the only limiting factor for wood stork nesting is prey. Now, there's no lack of trees for them to nest in, or nesting sites aren't a problem. Really, the primary thing is that they need prey. They need availability of aquatic fauna. Availability meaning not only the density of prey that they need, but they need to be able to get to them. We also know that when we shorten a Hydra period, and this goes back to research that's been done in the Everglades for decades, if we shorten a Hydra period, we have less time to raise fish, so we're getting fewer generations of fish. Those fish have a less growing time. They're going to stay smaller. You're selecting for smaller species of fish instead of the bigger sunfish that you'd find in the longer Hydra period areas. You're getting the smaller the smaller fish. You're going to have a lower density of fish again because they don't have the same reproduction time. And this is I have as a kind of a question mark because it's something I've been thinking about is with the changes we see in vegetation with changes in hydrology. We may be also making fish less available if we're letting some of these, if we're letting wetlands become inundated for longer. There's more vegetation in most cases, which oftentimes, depending on the type of vegetation, you can have fish there, but it can be difficult for wading birds to get in there to feed. You don't have the deeper water, the longer Hydra period often has more open water and makes it easier for them to feed when the concentrations do occur. And of course, the faster recession rates, like I think it was Betsy was talking about how these birds are moving across the landscape looking for these dry down pools. If the dry downs are happening so quick, we're getting really flashy dry downs, and it's making it harder for birds to really, I think, be able to track that. It definitely is, I think, a challenge for them. So not only fewer fish, but less time for them to be able to make use of these concentrated pools. And we know, at least at the Corkscrew colony, what this translates to for our storks. We've seen, since the 60s, a decrease in the average number of pairs of wood storks nesting at Corkscrew. And then this is the number of chicks as well. We see the decline. But interestingly, we don't see that decline match up with what I saw. I really saw the switch at 2000. So what was going on back in the 80s? So I think this is back when we go back to the question of land use. This is the Corkscrew colony here. This is a 30-kilometer radius, as we consider their core foraging area. The majority of their foraging is going to be within this area. This highlights the short Hydra period wetlands that were available or that existed pre-development. And as of 2004, these are the short hydro period wetlands that are wet, that are remaining. And so it really illustrates that not only are we moving into this habitat, we're preferentially losing these short hydro period wetlands, which we know are very important to wood storks early on in the nesting season when they're making a decision whether to nest or not, and getting that early season forage, getting the energy they need to begin the nesting process. I think it's also, I just completely lost that thought. I'll find it later. So we know the wood stork colonies declined concurrent. Oh, I know what I was going to say. We saw that change and that real drop off in the wood stork nesting between the 70s and the 80s, and coincidentally, maybe not, that's when this development really started to pick up in Southwest Florida. So I think that we're looking at kind of a combination of different factors that are really spelling bad news for the wood storks. So to conclude, the wood stork colonies decline concurrent with changes in land use throughout their core foraging area and that loss of short hydro period wetlands. The regional hydrology has, the changes that we've seen over the decades, I think definitely has implications for the prey production and the availability of prey throughout the landscape when the storks are here and they are trying to nest. And I think, and it's something I'd love to talk to Tim a little bit about, is I think that these changes that we're seeing in the regional hydrology are going to make wetland restoration a lot more challenging, especially if we're trying to build these short hydro period wetlands and we have that water table that's been dropped so far below what it was historically. But I think we really need to spend some time really trying to understand what's going on hydrologically. What are the causes? And what, if anything, can we do about it? What's going on? Really trying to weed out some of the potential factors and look more widespread. Where are we seeing this? And really try to get at what's going on. And the last thought I want to kind of leave you with, and I stole this from somebody's presentation I saw this past spring, but these are data from a whole bunch of tagged, or radio tagged, satellite tagged wood storks, but it really emphasizes how important Southwest Florida is for the whole Everglades population of wood storks, the whole southeastern United States population of wood storks. This is the migration corridor that they use every fall when they are coming down to begin their nesting in the Everglades, and they're always coming down this west coast of Florida. So for wood storks to really be able to be successful in the Everglades, this is their first stop. So this is really an important piece of the puzzle, not only for Southwest Florida, which is what we use the wood stork as an indicator for, but really for the species as a whole. We're really an important piece of the puzzle for their population. And that's it. I will be happy to take any questions.
Question, but is there any data for the timing of the thunderstorms? What time of day they arrive? Because this is anecdotal,
right?
And I posed this question to hydrologists in Big Cypress, and they said this is very interesting because we don't know. 2:30 in the afternoon when I was a kid, then 3:30, then 4:30, and what time in the afternoon did the thunderstorms hit down?
Interesting. I can tell you for sure we don't have those data here. We have daily rainfall data they're actually collected first thing in the morning. So the observation that we get first thing in the morning is what I consider yesterday's rainfall.
How about average humidity over the time of the day?
We don't have. We might have really patchy data that we've collected some clusters of years, but we don't have the current data on that at all.
And evaporation throughout that period and average sunlight and things like that.
Yeah, we don't have any of those data. Okay. But I think that's an interesting observation. I'd like to think about that. In the back, yeah.
Your graph showed the decline in stork population over approximately the last 20 years related to the graph of development, but we've been in an extreme housing recession since about 2005 until 2 years ago. Now the move in Lee County and Collier is rapid high development in these areas. Do you think things will get much worse for the population with lots of new development?
Well, I guess I could say, for me, the obvious answer is it could. I think that's where our policy team comes in and really trying to, really beat the drum for why these wetlands are so important. I think short hydro period wetlands have been so degraded. I'm not sure at this point losing more can do a whole lot more damage. But one thing I think that could happen is through trying to inform the developers, trying to use the science to inform some of that development, really trying to steer the way that they're building, like Serge was talking about, some of the way they're building some of these wetland retention areas. I showed the data for the loss in short hydro period wetlands. Along with that, we're seeing an increase in basically the real long hydro period wetlands or the open water areas. So those developments are going in and putting these big lakes in that hold water throughout the whole year. They're wetlands, but they're ponds. And those are what is replacing what we previously had as short hydro period wetlands. So I think maybe re-engineering on that end could try to stave off or reverse. And you know, Audubon's got a big effort now to really try to put energy into try to recreate short hydro period wetlands on a smaller scale to try to take back some of what's been lost. Yes.
Two questions, basic questions. So overall, in your statistics and your graphs and everything, the range that you and everything and the changes, is that overall good or bad for the wood storks?
Can you repeat the question?
That we've seen?
She's wondering if the overall changes that we've seen in the rainfall are good or bad for the wood storks. Well, I guess I was relieved that, well, there's nothing you can do about the rain, but I was relieved to see that it's not a climatological, it doesn't appear to be a climatological change, that we're still getting the same rain that we're getting back in the 1960s when the way, but it kind of takes that off the table and lets us focus on the other questions.
And I just forget, so are they already considered endangered?
They're federally threatened. They were endangered and they were downgraded, upgraded. They're changed to threatened.
Great. So if we have any more questions for Shawn, we're running a little bit late, but maybe we can talk to her after the discussion session or at lunch. Let's give Shawn a round of applause.
Yeah.